Well, that's a big tube. Welcome back. Today, Benny and I are going to talk about the 4570 and some of the offerings that you can find it in. Now, I find it a little fascinating that I've had a lot of requests to talk about the 4570 because, frankly, it's a fairly new cartridge in modern times. The cartridge is actually 145 years old this year, and it will be celebrating its Sesquicentennial in just 5 more years when it's 150 years old. But for a long time, it really disappeared from the scene. Let's go back to its introduction. It came out in the 1873 Springfield Trapdoor rifle. The 1873 Springfield Trapdoor rifle was actually it was a modification and improvement of an earlier design. Actually, there were about five different improvements of a rifle that was designed by Erskine S. Allen, who was the master armorer at Springfield Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts. The U.S. government had found itself with basically a dynamic problem of having a bunch of old muzzle-loading musket rifles left over from the Civil War production, and they didn't have any money at the time. The U.S. government had really, because of the Civil War, had really strapped itself, and its treasury was depleted. So they wanted to somehow or another put those firearms back into military service, but with a more modern cartridge, a more modern design. Most of the world had by this time gone to breech-loading firearms. So they set about to inquire about the possibility of modifying those Civil War era muzzle-loading percussion-fired rifles to handle breech-loading, some sort of breech-loading cartridge. So Erskine S. Allen, who was this master armorer, he came up with a concept which basically removed the top part of the breech of the firearm and replaced it with a cam-locked bolt that actually had an integrated firing pin to fire with the same side lock mechanism, the same hammer on the side. It was quite an inventive design. It had many design failings that were constantly at issue. It was originally designed with various types of cartridges and rimfire design and everything, and it just was the biggest problem was extraction. Finally, in concert with the 4570 cartridge release in 1873, it was finally adopted to have a sufficient spring-loaded mechanism that would eject the cartridge case afterwards. However, there were notable failings with that original release too, which lasted for a few years. The cartridge was not made of brass, but rather of copper. Copper has got far more, it's far more ductile than brass, which has a tin component, tin alloy. And as a result, the copper would seize against the chamber walls and create difficult extraction problems, especially when the cartridges were oftentimes corroded by being carried in leather gear. You've probably seen copper, which is copper, and even brass, which has been kept near leather gear too long, and it gets this almost moldy appearance. It's a fuzzy green, can be sometimes thick enough to be scraped off with a knife. That sort of corrosion would add to its basically poor release problems in the chamber. So the cartridges would frequently, after being fired, the cartridge cases would frequently seize inside the chamber, and without any implement to drive them out from the muzzle end, would require literally taking a knife or some sort of sharp object to pry at the case head and get that case out. Such was the case 3 years after the release of the rifle in its carbine form, and it was also because of the carbine being lighter. Its original loading of 45 ball 405 grain ball bullet with a 70 grains of black powder was reduced to about 50 to 55 grains of black powder for use in the carbines, which was a little bit more controllable for soldiers with the carbine model. And that's the carbine and the loading that went into the battle at the Little Bighorn with General George Armstrong Custer. Well, Erskine Allen's design basically prevailed throughout the latter part of the 1800s, and it lasted well into about the middle of the 1890s, when it was finally supplanted by the 30-40 Craig. And there were some other intermediate developments that were tried too. At that time, the U.S. Army was of the mind that their belief, the hierarchy's belief, was that providing repeating firearms, which were already available. Repeating firearms were used against Custer's forces at the Little Bighorn, with telling effects, plus with at least three times their number. Repeating Winchesters were used, and the soldiers were quickly outnumbered and decimated. But it was pretty solid belief that to equip a soldier with a repeating firearm in that time would basically deplete his ammo, cause him to waste his resources, and squander his ability to survive. So, well, as time changed, as time went on, understandings about the realities changed. We were really up against significantly better firearms that were designed by Paul Mauser in the late 1800s when we encountered them in the Spanish-American War. And we were fighting at that time against them with 30-40 Craigs, and they were using 7x57 Mausers, with much more streamlined bullets, better ballistic effect, and everything else. And our second line troops were actually equipped with the old 1873 Springfields, and so they were really terribly outgunned. Now, the cartridge itself, the 4570, this one here happens to be a New England Firearms adaptation of a Harrington and Richardson topper. It's a single shot gun. It's got a heavy thick barrel wall, which is good because this gun can put down some recoil, which I'll talk about. But it has a very broad range of available bullet weights. The standard traditional bullet weight of 405 grains. It can also be had in bullet weights which are 300 and 325, 350, and so forth, all the way up to 460. Sometimes even 500 grain bullet weights are available. And certainly a bunch of pistol bullets can be loaded in it that will work very well too. So it has a broad range of bullet weights available and bullet styles available, up to and including the 458 Winchester style bullet, which is a full metal jacket, very heavy steel case jacket, and even the solid bullet, which is used on elephant and dangerous game in Africa. So it can be used with even those bullets. Now, the 4570 is not a high velocity cartridge. Its standard original loading went out at 1,310 feet per second. A 405 grain bullet at 1,310 feet per second, which is really slow mail these days. We're talking about cartridges that really get well up into the 3000s without any difficulty. So we're in an entirely different realm. This is the type of cartridge which you have to understand is not a long-range cartridge. It's a cartridge which is designed to do what it does best, is to affect a lot of tissue damage because of a wide wound channel. And that wide wound channel will create a lot of immediate killing and very significant energy to bust through bones, and also too for the woodland hunter is able to bust through some fairly thick brush effectively. So it's a good cartridge for use in thick woodlands, and that's why it's a very highly favored cartridge by a lot of people who live in Alaska, or trappers and things who may be encountering dangerous game unexpectedly. As a, they use them as basically as a survival defensive gun in those situations. So it's a very, very effective cartridge in its standard loading. Now, through the years, the rifle has been greatly improved upon. One of the more popular versions of the 4570 cartridge in terms of a rifle was the 1895 Marlin lever action, which was based on a 336 style lever design, and it's still very popular today. That rifle was originally produced from 1895 until 1917, which was the time of the First World War over in Europe. In 1917, Marlin discontinued that rifle. It had been produced by other, including Winchester. Other companies had produced it time and again, but largely the 4570 fell out of favor. This is to be expected anytime you look back in history through American cartridges. As the military picked up a cartridge, so did the civilian market pick it up. It just was a natural thing. Whatever was good for the military was good for the hunter. But as the military discontinued an offering, unless it had some staying power, such as the 3006, it really just most cartridges simply fell out of favor fairly quickly. Such was the case was the 3040 Craig, which, by the way, was a fairly good rifle. It was a very slick design, very smooth operating design, but it had an awkward loading system with a door that opened up, and you basically rolled the cartridges in loose, and it was a rimmed cartridge which would not adapt well to a bolt-action rifle. So the 3040 Craig, without the Craig Jorgensen rifle to support it, that fell out of favor. Well, the 4570 quickly fell out of favor as modern high-velocity cartridges became popular. Now, it remained on the scene. It never really went away like some of the other big rimmed cartridges went away. The various manufacturers continued to produce it throughout the 20th century in limited numbers. You'll find references to it if you look in the older gun digests that were produced by, edited by John T. Amber. They'd have a little bit of information about the 4570, and most notably, he credited the cartridge with being able to handle any size game in North America whatsoever, including big bears, very, very adequately, and with little accompanying tissue destruction, without having a massive capillary destruction, we'll call it. As I've discussed in some other occasions, high-velocity bullets, when they strike tissue, brings along with it a lot of hydraulic fluid disruption in the tissue. So the blood basically starts bursting capillaries and causes a lot of bruising, and that bruised meat is just not edible. It's not palatable. So it tends to, high-velocity bullets tend to, as long as the high-velocity tissue damage stays within the lung region, lungs are tissue, as long as it stays within the lung region largely, it's a very suitable situation. But once it starts, getting beyond lung tissue, then it starts causing unnecessary meat destruction. But the 4570 has the ability to punch a big wound channel and get the job done, and to also break down bones of large game without any difficulty, but at the same time not being overly destructive with regard to tissue. So there are three current classifications of the 4570 that have developed. But I'll talk about those in a second. I want to tell you what happened that brought the 4570 back. And it really wasn't the 4570 that brought it back so much as another cartridge. The 444 Marlin was a introduction of the Marlin company with its 336 lever action in 1965. Marlin reintroduced this big bore concept with the 444 Marlin, which was a lengthened version of the 44 Remington Magnum. It looks like a piggybacked 44 Remington Magnum. Unfortunately, its first release was with the same bullet, with a 240 grain lead bullet, which was the same round that was used in the handguns. And at rifle velocities, it became overly frangible and tended to upset on impact without really having the penetration that was required for the larger game that it was being advertised for. So that was quickly remedied, and heavier constructed bullets were soon provided for it. But this brought back, I think, a little bit of interest in a modern era. We're talking now in the 1965. All of a sudden now, people were no longer necessarily focused on just medium bore cartridges, but just like so many other things, another fad just started, and a few people were interested now in the big bore concept, which was also fomented by the writings of Elmer Keith, who was a big bore fan, and things like that. So there was a little bit of popularity that rose up with the 444 Marlin, and which spilled over a little bit later. In 1972, Marlin decided to bring out their 336 Marlin again in the 4570, but in honor of the original in honor of the original rifle, they renamed it the 1895 Marlin. And I would say that in my own personal knowledge of it, the popularity was sufficient to provide it for production realities, and Marlin continued to produce it, and it just kind of went along lazily for quite a number of years. But this medium right here, with people being able to see the 4570's ability to swing heavy steel targets and kick up a lot of sand when it impacts and things like this. It's a fascinating thing to watch on YouTube. So, and there's a lot of people who are really putting out some good visuals on the 4570 and other cartridges of its type. Now the 4570 has it's got a tremendous amount of impact, and that's at both ends, both at the muzzle end and at the back end here. Make no mistake about it. When you shoot a 4570, you're shooting a rifle with some significant recoil. So how significant am I talking? Well, the standard factory loading of the 4570 that runs out at about 1,320 feet per second, that loading right there typically can run around 20 foot-pounds of free recoil with a standard gun of 6. This one here happens to be 6 3/4 pounds. These rifles can run anywhere between 6.5 pounds or so up to 7.5 pounds, depending on barrel length and construction, how long the magazine tube is and things. So with a rifle of that sort of composition and size, you can expect recoil levels to be up in the region of about a 30-06, a standard 30-06, which is scoped with a fully equipped rifle. So it starts out at that level with the lowest velocity loading. It's the standard loading. The three different loadings that have developed through the years, they're categories, I should call them. The first category of loading is simply called the trapdoor loading. That's the standard government loading. That particular, and now we're no longer loading black powder cartridges per se, except for certain cowboy shooting activities that may have that interest. But largely we're speaking about good modern smokeless powders and good quick burning stuff that creates good velocity with good efficiency with a big bore. But the original loading velocity, which is called the trapdoor loading, should always be the one which is picked if you have a trapdoor Springfield rifle or a replica thereof. For instance, the Uberti Italian rifle and carbine. Those rifles, even though they're very strong, modern firearms with good high-grade steel, they are still limited to the original standard loading. That design does not have the strength that's necessary. Remember what it was built upon. That original concept was built upon the old leftover muzzle-loading firearms that were used during the Civil War. So the structure of the design simply does not withstand heavy pressures. The pressures of those breeches are limited to the mid-20s, 25, 26,000 pounds per square inch breech pressure. And to be very honest with you, most of the actual standard loadings run with breech pressure that's less than 20,000. So they keep them down because they know that they can easily be put into a very old relic firearm that could be disastrously compromised. So that's the first level, and that level can be used in any kind of 45-70. It's the lowest powered loading, but it's sufficient really for any game animal in North America. This is not a long-range cartridge, and don't think that by adding velocity that you can markedly improve the trajectory in any measurable way. There's a difference of approximately 150 feet per second between the first category, which is the trapdoor loading, up to the second category, which is the 1895 loading. That's the standard Marlin breech pressures that can be up into the 40,000 pounds per square inch. That's a good, strong lever-action rifle that can handle those sort of pressures without any difficulty. And if you're a hand loader, or if you're a person who buys custom ammunition from certain companies that offer these higher velocity loadings, these are loadings which have to be used with great caution. Make sure that you follow the admonishments on the box, and don't run them in older, weaker guns. But those intermediate loadings will really get the job done without any difficulty, and they're terrific loadings for anybody who wants to, literally load up for bear. Those will add about, like I say, about 125, 150 feet per second over their original factory counterpart. Now the third category is basically it's what they classically call the Ruger number 3 action loading, or the number 1 action loading. I said that in 1972, Marlin reintroduced the 45-70 in the 1895 Marlin. And just 1 year after that, Bill Ruger noticed the popularity of that cartridge, and he introduced his number 3 in which is a modification, just simply a design modification, external design modification of the Ruger number 1. It has kind of the classic, Winchester high and low wall appearance, and it just evokes that old era of the Schutzen rifle and stuff. And it was a very popular rifle, which has unfortunately gone out of production, to my knowledge. But that rifle has very strong breech pressures, and those loadings can exceed 50,000 pounds per square inch. Now, don't just presume that because that rifle is also capable of handling cartridges with excessive 60,000 pounds of pressure that you can do the same thing with a 45-70. We're talking about a cartridge case that was designed 145 years ago, and it's not designed with the web strength that's sufficient to handle that particular type of pressure. So don't wax sentimental about some ideas that you can turn your favorite Ruger number 3 or Ruger number 1 into a 458 Winchester Magnum with a 45-70 case. You can't do it. It's just not going to be done. There's a difference of not only the internal breech pressure, but the cartridge case capacity is significantly greater with the 458 Winchester Magnum, which runs the velocities up at least another 400 feet per second. So the 45-70 is what the 45-70 does best. It's a great historical cartridge which dates back nearly 150 years now, and it has a tremendous history in both lever actions and single shot rifles, and it's a very adaptable firearm and cartridge for so many different things that an American can use, whether it's from being in the deep bush in Maine or in Alaska or down in Florida shooting shooting hogs. Wherever you are, it's a great cartridge for that. It's a round which should be kept within 125 to 150 yards. It not only has a very pronounced rainbow trajectory beyond that range, but it also, because of its poor ballistic coefficient, the ballistic coefficient is only about 185 to 190 or so at best. That's not very high ballistic coefficients compared to your modern Spitzer bullets that can maintain headway without their velocities being shortened. The 45-70 it begins plummeting to the earth like a rock, and it has because of its poor ballistic coefficient, the velocity peels off very, very quickly every inch down range. So it's a 100-yard cartridge, 125, 150 yards at most. That's where it should be kept. And it's just simply, it's a good gun for what it does. It's not a long-range cartridge. If you need a long-range gun, you should buy a long-range cartridge to go in it and not be playing with such things as the 45 caliber bore. So it's a wonderful round for virtually any kind of hunting in the States, and in many parts of the world for that matter. It's extremely high velocity loadings, that run close to 1,700 feet per second with a very heavy bullet. You can actually use the 500 grain steel case bullets in it, and you can get within 400 feet per second of a 458 Winchester Magnum, and within 500 feet per second or so of a 458 lot. They can truly, honestly be carried, into Africa with, for heavy, dangerous game. But it's a gun which you have to remember barks at both ends. The recoil effect of going up just 150 feet per second with the intermediate loading means nearly, in most rifles, adding at least 10 pounds of free recoil to that rifle. So you're going from 20 foot-pounds of free recoil up to 30 even greater foot-pounds of recoil, depending on the powder charge. That's where the recoil, the additional recoil comes from. It's not from just that small 125 to 150 foot per second increase in velocity. It's from the tremendous increase in powder charge which is required to boost it at that velocity. Velocity and powder charges do not run in parallel. It requires significantly more powder to achieve a very small amount of velocity increase. So it's like a 20% increase in powder charge in order to affect about a 10% or less velocity increase. So as you seek to attain just that extra 200 or 300 feet per second of velocity increase going up the scale, you're markedly increasing the belt on the back end of that rifle. The heaviest loads with the heaviest powder charges, with the heaviest bullets, the 405 grain bullets, even 350 grain bullets, you can be talking about over 40 foot-pounds of free recoil. You're up in the neighborhood of a 458 Winchester Magnum in a standard weight rifle. 458 Winchester Magnum is running around a 9 or 10 pound rifle typically. An African grade rifle is typically 9 to 10 pounds. The typical 45-70 is running 6.25 to 7.5 pounds. Those trimming off that weight for that nice light lever action that you carry around the brush means that you really get slammed with it. So you have to take it easy. It's a rifle I highly recommend for any kind of game in the United States and North America and in many parts of the world, but it's not a rifle I can hardly recommend for any novice shooters. It's a veteran's rifle. It's a rifle which a veteran shooter should approach with some deliberation, because it's not a novice's rifle. It's not the first rifle that somebody should buy simply to have a gun that they can go hunting anything with, because it's one of those rifles that returns to the shop with a brand new rifle with 35 rounds to go back to the store with it to be sold. Because a lot of people really, they take it out to the range, fire 1 or 2 shots with it, and they discover that it's not exactly their cup of tea. So before you get into that financial situation where you waste $500 or $600 or $700 on a brand new rifle that you all of a sudden have a bad taste for, try to find somebody who has one and check it out. Try one out and put it up to your shoulder and shoot it, and see how you're doing with it. Don't just shoot it, but see if you're able to accurately shoot it, because it's a great flinch developer. It's not a rifle which I would recommend to somebody who is prone to flinching. I'm going to talk about handling recoil again. I did discuss it in one of my first videos, but I'm going to talk about handling recoil again, so that you can understand that you can handle very, very heavy recoil, but not typically in the way that I often see done on videos. Bracing yourself, buttressing your body against recoil is not the way to handle it. That's the last thing you should do. You should never buttress yourself, position your body anchored to the ground so that the rifle is stoutly resisted. To do that, you basically you're gonna eat that recoil right in your jaw, and it's a very jarring effect. Recoil is best handled standing on your hind legs with your feet fairly close together, no more than hip width apart, without a pronounced forward lean. Just shoot it and just squeeze it off and let the rifle rock back. It basically just follows back. And it's not going to tip you over unless you only weigh 110 pounds. It's not going to tip you over, so you don't need to buttress yourself and force yourself into that stock. Allow yourself to just simply swing with it, and you'd be surprised how much recoil your body can handle. And that's how you handle the 45-70 and any heavy recoiling rifle. So it's a rifle I hardly recommend for anybody who is inclined towards hunting in the brush, who likes to maybe take on big game, elk, whatever it is. If you happen to have a liking for just a lot of bullet weight and stuff like that, and if you can handle the recoil, it's a terrific gun. Now, one other thing. All those big numbers come along with raw material usage. That means that when you're shooting 405 grain lead bullets, you're chewing up an awful lot of wheel weights if you're casting your own. Bullets cost a lot because as the weight of them goes up, the cost goes up. That's how they charge for bullets. It's by weight and size. So consider that before you factor in a 45-70 into your safe. So those are the things that you want to consider. Try one out if you possibly can. That's the best thing you can do before you go out and buy one. Or at least if you're wondering how the recoil is, maybe try somebody's 3006, something like that has a similar recoil, and say to yourself, how would that be if I were shooting that in a lightweight, thinly stocked lever action? Because lever action rifles typically are made as saddle carbines, and they don't have, they're made with flat profiles, and they don't have an awful lot of butt plate material. So that's all the stuff that you need to consider with care. So again, I strongly recommend the 45-70 for, hardly recommend it for any kind of game in North America, especially for somebody who doesn't want to chew up an awful lot of dinner fare. And whatever you do, be sure to shoot safely, and subscribe. Tell your friends about my channel, and God bless.